She was 22, full of dreams and hours away from a weekend with friends. As she lay asleep in a quiet home in Columbia, South Carolina, someone broke in. A man with a long record, a stranger to her, entered that house and ended her life. This wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. Today, we delve into the tragic story of Logan Federico, a 22-year-old college student from Waxhaw, North Carolina, who aspired to become a teacher. On May 3rd, 2025, while visiting friends in Columbia, South Carolina, Logan's life was cut short in a senseless act of violence. She was fatally shot during a home invasion on Cypress Street. The alleged perpetrator, 30-year-old Alexander Dickey, has a long criminal history, including nearly 40 charges over the past decade. This incident has raised serious questions about how someone with such an extensive record was free to commit further crimes. Logan Federico was just 22 years old, a bright, driven student from Waxhaw, North Carolina, with her entire future mapped out. She was studying education with dreams of becoming a teacher, someone who would shape young lives and inspire the next generation. Friends say she had the kind of warmth that made people feel instantly comfortable. Her laugh was contagious, her energy magnetic. She worked 2 jobs to put herself through college, not because she had to, but because she wanted to build something for herself to earn it. She loved kids, loved helping others, and always talked about the classroom she hoped to have one day. Her father described her as strong, vibrant, and full of life. She wasn't just someone with potential, she was already making an impact in the lives around her. On the weekend of May 3rd, she took a short trip to Columbia, South Carolina, to unwind and visit friends. It was supposed to be a quiet, simple break. Instead, it became the setting for an unthinkable tragedy, the end of a life that had only just begun. Logan Federico had no idea that a quiet weekend getaway would become the end of her life. She had traveled from her hometown of Waxhaw, North Carolina, to Columbia, South Carolina, to visit close friends, a short break from the routine stress of college life. She wasn't partying, she wasn't out late, she wasn't doing anything reckless. She was simply spending time with people she cared about in a peaceful residential neighborhood on Cypress Street. She had arrived just days before the attack, likely looking forward to laughs, comfort food, maybe a movie night or two, nothing extraordinary, just the kind of weekend any college student might enjoy after a week of lectures, work, and responsibilities. The home she was staying in wasn't known for trouble. There were no red flags, no warning signs, no indication that danger was lurking nearby. Logan had done what millions of young people do every weekend. She trusted the world to be safe enough for her to rest. But what happened next wasn't just a tragedy. It was a nightmare no one saw coming. A man with a violent past, a career criminal, randomly chose that home as his next target. Logan never even had a chance to defend herself. According to law enforcement, this was a burglary gone horribly wrong, a senseless act that took the life of a young woman who had done absolutely nothing to put herself at risk. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a brutal reminder that sometimes danger finds the innocent, and when the system fails to stop repeat offenders, the consequences are irreversible. It was late on the night of May 3rd, 2025. Logan Federico was asleep inside a home on Cypress Street in Columbia, South Carolina. She had likely gone to bed thinking about nothing more than the weekend ahead, just another quiet night in a familiar house surrounded by friends. But outside, in the shadows, someone else had plans. According to police reports, 30-year-old Alexander Dickey, a man with a long and violent criminal history, was in the middle of a burglary spree. He was targeting homes at random, and that night he chose the house where Logan was staying. Around the early hours of the morning, Dickey allegedly forced his way into the residence. Reports indicate that he stole multiple credit cards and other belongings. But this wasn't just a theft. At some point during the break-in, Logan was shot while she slept. Authorities believe she never had time to react, never even woke up. By the time her friends or neighbors realized what had happened, it was already too late. Logan was found inside the home with fatal injuries, and a frantic 911 call followed. There was no known connection between Logan and the suspect, no personal motive. This was a random, senseless act, a moment of brutal violence that ended a young woman's life and left a community in shock. And the most haunting part, this wasn't the first time Alexander Dickey had been in trouble with the law. But on this night, it would be the most devastating. It was the morning of May 3rd, 2025, quiet, still just like any other Saturday. Inside a small residence on Cypress Street in Columbia, South Carolina, a horrifying discovery was about to shatter that peace. Friends or residents of the home where Logan Federico had been staying found her unresponsive in one of the bedrooms. She had been asleep just hours earlier. Now she was gone. Panic set in and someone dialed 911. First responders rushed to the scene and found Logan with a fatal wound to the chest. Paramedics confirmed she had died during the night, sometime between her final moments of rest and the cold silence of the early morning. Columbia Police Chief Skip Holbrook described what they found as a random, brutal act. The home had signs of forced entry. Personal items, including credit cards, were missing. But what stood out most was the complete lack of connection between Logan and the person believed to be responsible. She hadn't known him, hadn't interacted with him. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Authorities quickly determined this wasn't a targeted attack. It was part of a string of random burglaries that escalated violently. And Logan, who had only come to Columbia to visit friends, paid the ultimate price for a stranger's crime spree. The news stunned the neighborhood. A young woman full of dreams taken while she slept, and somewhere out there, her killer was still on the run. As soon as police realized that Logan Federico's death was not a domestic incident, but the result of a violent home invasion, the search for her killer turned urgent. Investigators quickly identified a suspect, 30-year-old Alexander Dickey, a man whose name was already familiar to law enforcement. Dickey had a long rap sheet, nearly 40 prior arrests over the past decade. Charges included burglary, drug possession, resisting arrest, and more. He had spent years in and out of jail, often released only to reoffend. To some, he was just another name in the system. But now he was the center of a deadly manhunt. In the hours after Logan's body was discovered, police followed the trail left behind by Dickey. Surveillance footage and transaction records showed that someone had used Logan's stolen credit cards to make purchases at gas stations and stores around West Columbia and Saluda County. It was enough for police to begin piecing together his movements. At one point, when the stolen vehicle Dickey was driving broke down, he contacted a towing company using his own name. That led police to a residence in Gaston, South Carolina. But by the time they arrived, Dickey had already fled into the dense woods nearby, disappearing into thick brush as the sun began to set. Officers launched a full-scale search of the area. Helicopters, K-9 units, and ground teams were deployed. But the terrain was difficult, the weather uncooperative, and Dickey had vanished. The next morning, a resident spotted a disheveled man emerging from the woods barefoot, desperate, and armed. The man stole another vehicle and returned to the same house he had been tracked to the day before. There, he broke in again, set a fire inside, and barricaded himself. That reckless move would be his last mistake. Police surrounded the property. As smoke began to rise from the home, they moved in and found Dickey hiding in a bathroom. The manhunt had ended, but the questions were just beginning. To understand the outrage surrounding Logan Federico's death, you have to look at the man accused of taking her life, Alexander Dickey. He wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't someone who slipped through the cracks once. He was a textbook example of a system that had been warned over and over again. Dickey is 30 years old, with a criminal record stretching back more than a decade. According to public arrest records and reports from Wise News and local law enforcement, he had been arrested nearly 40 times since 2012. His charges ranged from drug offenses and petty theft to burglary, resisting arrest, and more violent crimes. In some cases, he had served jail time. In others, he'd been released with probation or after short stints behind bars. And that's the part that has people furious. How was someone with this much of a criminal history allowed back into society without stricter oversight? Why weren't there consequences that kept him from reoffending? Why was there no mechanism in place to monitor someone with a pattern this clear? Police described Dickey as a career criminal, a term used for individuals who show a repeated, habitual pattern of criminal behavior. But the label doesn't mean much if there are no actions behind it, no real barriers, no interventions that stick. By the time Dickey entered the home on Cypress Street, he had already been given dozens of second chances. He had already been warned, arrested, processed, released, and still nothing stopped him. Now he's facing some of the most serious charges imaginable: first-degree murder, burglary, arson, and multiple theft-related offenses. He's being held without bond at the Lexington County Detention Center, but the damage is already done. Logan Federico is gone, and the man accused of killing her didn't just come out of nowhere. He came out of a system that saw his name 40 times and somehow never saw this coming. Was Logan Federico's murder an isolated tragedy or the direct result of a justice system that failed to do its job? That's the question echoing far beyond Columbia, South Carolina. Because this wasn't a case of someone with no prior record suddenly snapping. This was a man who had been arrested nearly 40 times, a man flagged for repeat offenses, a man the system knew well and still let walk free. Alexander Dickey's criminal history paints a picture of escalating behavior over a decade. Time after time, he was arrested and released. Sometimes he served brief sentences. Sometimes he was put on probation. But there was a pattern, and that pattern was ignored. And Logan paid the price. In the days after her death, local media and residents began demanding answers. Why was a man with this record not being more closely monitored? How did someone with such a violent past gain access to weapons, cars, homes, and people without anyone stopping him? The Columbia Police Department has labeled the crime a random act of violence, and technically it was. But when a person has a documented history of criminal activity and they're still able to commit a murder in a home they had no business being in, is it really random or is it negligence? This is the hard truth that many communities are grappling with, that even when someone is flagged, processed, and known by the system, there's often no follow-through, no long-term solution, just a revolving door. The justice system is built on the promise of protecting the public, but in this case it didn't. Logan's death is more than a heartbreaking story. It's a case study in what happens when accountability gets buried under bureaucracy. And if it happened to her, how many others are still at risk? News of Logan Federico's death spread quickly and hit hard. In Waxhaw, North Carolina, where she grew up, and in Columbia, South Carolina, where she was visiting friends, the shock was immediate. But it wasn't just about the crime. It was about who Logan was and what was stolen from the world when her life ended. Her college campus held an emotional vigil. Friends, classmates, and professors gathered with candles, handwritten notes, and photos of Logan smiling in hallways and classrooms. Faculty members described her as bright, compassionate, and determined. She was the kind of student who stayed after class to help others, who talked openly about her dream to teach underserved children, and who never shied away from hard work. In her hometown, neighbors decorated her family's front yard with flowers and purple ribbons, Logan's favorite color. A local church service was held in her memory. Her father, speaking through tears at a press conference, described her as strong, fun-loving, and deeply committed to becoming a teacher. "She didn't deserve this," he said. "She was just sleeping. She didn't even know what hit her." Online, tributes poured in. Social media became a space for grief, remembrance, and rage. Hashtags like #JusticeForLogan and #Logan Federico began trending locally. Former classmates posted memories of her helping them study. Families she babysat for remembered her patience and warmth with children. Even people who didn't know her began sharing the story, horrified that a future educator, a woman who only wanted to make a difference, had been taken in such a brutal, meaningless way. And through all the sorrow, one question kept coming up. How many more Logans will there be before something changes? Her death didn't just wound a family, it shook a community. It reminded everyone that no one is truly safe when accountability is missing, and that the cost of inaction isn't just statistics, it's lives like Logan's. Young, kind, full of promise, gone. The arrest of Alexander Dickey brought temporary relief to a grieving community, but it also opened the door to a complex legal battle. Now, prosecutors are preparing to try a man with one of the most extensive criminal records in recent memory for one of the most senseless murders the city has seen in years. Dickey is facing a long list of charges, with the most serious being first-degree murder for the death of Logan Federico. According to police, the crime was committed during the commission of another felony, a burglary, which automatically elevates the severity of the charge under South Carolina law. This means the prosecution can seek life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or even the death penalty, depending on how the case develops and what aggravating circumstances are proven. In addition to murder, Dickey has been charged with first-degree burglary, arson for allegedly setting fire to a home during his attempt to evade arrest, grand larceny tied to the theft of multiple vehicles, financial transaction card theft and fraud for using Logan's stolen credit cards at various businesses, possession of a firearm during the commission of a violent crime, second-degree domestic violence unrelated but surfaced during investigation. These charges are stacking fast. Some may be federal if prosecutors determine that stolen items or cards crossed state lines. At the moment, Dickey is being held without bond at the Lexington County Detention Center. Legal experts say that the scope of this case, which involves burglary, murder, arson, and financial crimes, is already shaping up to be one of the most closely watched trials in the state. And while the legal system is moving quickly, the pain behind every courtroom motion is still deeply personal. Because at the heart of this case isn't just the question of what Alexander Dickey did, it's the question of how many red flags were ignored before he did it. Since his arrest, Alexander Dickey's case has moved swiftly through the early stages of the legal system, and all eyes are watching. As of now, he's being held without bond at the Lexington County Detention Center, a clear indication that the court considers him a danger to the public and a flight risk. Prosecutors are building what they've called an overwhelming case, stacked with evidence gathered from surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and witness accounts. Law enforcement officials have confirmed that Dickey used credit cards stolen from Logan Federico shortly after the break-in. Those transactions were captured on security cameras at several locations, tying him directly to the crime scene and the hours that followed. The burned-down house in Gaston, where he was found hiding in a bathroom, added another layer of serious charges, including arson and unlawful entry. At his initial court appearance, the judge denied bond and informed Dickey of the full scope of the charges. The courtroom was tense. Family members of the victim were present but chose not to speak. Their silence said enough. Legal analysts suggest that the prosecution may consider pursuing the death penalty due to the combination of felony murder and the sheer brutality of the act. However, that decision will likely come after a formal indictment by a grand jury, which is expected in the coming weeks. The defense for now has remained quiet, no plea has been entered, and no public statements have been made. Some speculate Dickey may undergo psychological evaluation, especially considering the fire he set and the erratic behavior following the murder. In the meantime, the community continues to mourn, but they're also watching closely, hoping the justice system that failed to stop him before will at least deliver accountability now. The wheels of justice are turning, slowly maybe, but this time no one is looking away. Before Logan Federico became a headline, she was a daughter, a friend, a student, and a dreamer. The kind of person who made you feel like you mattered even in a crowded room. And while the world may now know her because of a senseless tragedy, those closest to her remember something different, her life, not just her death. Logan grew up in Waxhaw, North Carolina, a small town where people still look out for one another. Her father, Stephen Federico, describes her as spicy, not in attitude, but in spirit. She was bold, vibrant, full of energy. She didn't just dream of becoming a teacher, she was already living like one. She worked 2 jobs while studying education in college, one of which included babysitting, where she built strong bonds with the children and families she helped. She was someone who stood out not because she tried to, but because she cared. Logan was the kind of person who stayed late to help classmates, who lit up when talking about lesson plans and how to make learning fun. She once told a friend that she wanted to be the teacher that kids remember for the rest of their lives. Photos show a young woman with a warm smile and fierce determination in her eyes. Friends say she was the one who always made sure no one sat alone. She had a thing for bad reality TV, loved purple, and never turned down a chance to dance, even if there was no music playing. Her death left a hole in the lives of everyone who knew her, but her memory continues to inspire. One of her professors posted online, "Logan was already a teacher, she just didn't get the chance to have her own classroom." And maybe that's the hardest part of all. The world didn't just lose a young woman, it lost everything she was going to become: a mentor, a guide, a role model. And for those who knew her, that pain doesn't fade, it deepens. But so does the resolve to make sure she isn't forgotten. As news of Logan Federico's death broke, local headlines quickly turned into a national outcry. What started as a tragic local homicide in Columbia, South Carolina, soon captured attention across major outlets. New York Post, People, ABC News, and multiple South Carolina stations began reporting the story, each uncovering new layers of horror, heartbreak, and outrage. The narrative struck a nerve not just because of how young and innocent Logan was, but because of how preventable her murder seemed. The combination of a promising college student killed in her sleep and a career criminal with nearly 40 prior charges made this more than just a news report, it became a symbol of systemic failure. Social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag #JusticeForLogan trended regionally, with people from all over the US demanding answers. TikTok and YouTube creators began sharing the timeline of events, calling out the justice system, and even comparing the case to other high-profile failures of parole oversight. True crime forums lit up with outrage and sadness, calling the case haunting and sickening. Journalists didn't stop at the surface. Many delved deep into Alexander Dickey's criminal record, publishing timeline breakdowns showing how often he had been arrested and released. Local news segments showed community vigils, interviews with heartbroken family members, and scenes of the burned-out house in Gaston where Dickey was finally captured. But what made this case different and kept it in the spotlight was that everyone could relate to it. Logan wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, resting in a friend's home. Her story highlighted a terrifying truth. Sometimes, even when you do everything right, the system doesn't protect you. The media attention hasn't faded, and as the legal process moves forward, the spotlight remains focused not just on the crime itself, but on the policies, loopholes, and blind spots that may have allowed it to happen. In a world overloaded with headlines, Logan's story broke through because it demanded more than sympathy. It demanded accountability. Logan Federico's death didn't just spark grief, it reignited a nationwide conversation about safety, justice, and how repeat offenders are handled in America. Communities, both in Colombia and far beyond, began asking hard questions. How many warnings do we ignore before someone finally pays the price? And why are we waiting for tragedies like this to act? In the days after the murder, local leaders in South Carolina faced mounting pressure to re-examine laws around repeat offenses, early release, and parole oversight. Logan's case became a catalyst, not just a crime to mourn, but a failure to learn from. At her university and in nearby neighborhoods, campus safety became a front-page issue. Students questioned whether local authorities were doing enough to protect residents. Parents voiced concerns about their children living off campus or traveling across state lines. For many young women especially, Logan's story hit close to home. She was doing everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Gun violence, burglary, home security all became part of the conversation. But this wasn't just about crime statistics. It was about the feeling that the system is reactive, not proactive, that we wait for lives to be lost before we demand accountability. Logan's father, Stephen Federico, spoke out not only to honor his daughter, but to push for reform. This wasn't just a one-time event, he said. It was the result of years of missed chances to stop someone before it got this far. Advocacy groups have begun citing her case in campaigns to tighten parole regulations and increase public access to offender histories. Some are calling for Logan's Law legislation that would introduce stricter monitoring for individuals with extensive criminal backgrounds who are released back into communities. It's too late to save Logan, but her story has already begun changing the conversation. And maybe, just maybe, that change can save someone else. At some point, we have to stop calling these stories shocking and start calling them what they really are: predictable. What happened to Logan Federico was horrifying, but it wasn't unthinkable. It wasn't random in the way the word is usually used. It was the direct result of years of a broken system, letting the same man fall through the same cracks again and again, until someone finally lost their life. Logan's murder wasn't the first violent crime Alexander Dickey was connected to. It wasn't his first burglary. It wasn't even his first arrest that year. He had nearly 40 charges on his record. That's not a red flag, that's a 5-alarm fire. And yet, he was out. So how did we get here? How do we live in a system that allows someone with that kind of history to walk the streets unchecked, able to break into a home in the middle of the night, shoot a sleeping woman, steal her cards, and vanish into the woods like it's just another day? We talk a lot about accountability in our society, but who's holding the system accountable when it fails to do the one job it was built for: protecting people like Logan? This isn't about politics. It's not about left or right, it's about right and wrong. It's about a 22-year-old woman who worked 2 jobs, studied hard, and wanted to become a teacher. A woman who never got to walk across that graduation stage, never got to decorate her first classroom, never got to become the teacher that kids remembered for the rest of their lives. Logan didn't fall through the cracks. She was pushed by apathy, by oversight, by a justice system that talks tough but too often acts soft until it's too late. And the next time someone tells you these things just happen, remember Logan Federico, because this didn't just happen. It was allowed to. As of now, Alexander Dickey sits behind bars in the Lexington County Detention Center, held without bond. His next court appearances are expected in the coming weeks, and legal experts anticipate that a grand jury will move quickly to formally indict him on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, arson, burglary, and the use of stolen financial information. If prosecutors pursue the death penalty, which is legal in South Carolina, that decision could take months, but the groundwork is already being laid. Given the severity and brutality of the case, legal analysts believe it's a real possibility. At the very least, Dickey is facing life in prison without parole. But justice in this case won't be swift. Trials like this can take a year or more to fully unfold. Logan's family has made it clear that they will be there every step of the way. They want answers, they want accountability, and they want change not just for their daughter, but for the next family that might find themselves in the same nightmare. Meanwhile, the public pressure is still building. Local lawmakers are reportedly considering proposals to increase restrictions on parole eligibility for repeat violent offenders. Community leaders are pushing for improved victim protection and reforms to prevent career criminals from slipping through the cracks again. And then there's the memory of Logan, still fresh, still raw. Her friends are planning scholarships in her name. Her professors are lobbying for stronger campus safety measures. And her family? They're turning their grief into a mission to make sure her death means something. Because what happens next isn't just about a courtroom. It's about the ripple effect of a life taken too soon, and whether or not we're willing to finally fix the cracks in a system that let it happen. Logan Federico's story shouldn't fade into the endless scroll of tragic headlines. She wasn't just a name, a statistic, or a case file. She was a 22-year-old woman with a future, a teacher in the making, a daughter, a friend, a soul full of purpose. What happened to her wasn't just heartbreaking, it was infuriating, and more than anything, it was preventable. If this story made you feel something, sadness, anger, frustration, don't let it stop at feeling. Share this video. Talk about it. Talk about how someone with 40 prior arrests was allowed back on the street. Talk about how the system didn't just fail Logan, it ignored her before she ever needed protection. Let's use her name to push for something better. Let's demand real accountability for the people and the policies that allow violent offenders to disappear into neighborhoods unnoticed until it's too late. And to Logan's family, if you're watching, your grief is not invisible. Your daughter's life mattered, and her story is not going unheard. If you want to follow this case as it develops, and if you believe stories like this need to be told, subscribe to the channel. Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's keep this conversation going. Because silence didn't save Logan, but speaking up just might save someone else.